The dining room was quiet except for the gentle clinking of silverware and the occasional creak of the old wood floor. Pam sat at the head of the table, her posture dignified, her pale blue sweater neatly pressed, and her silver hair curled the way she liked it. The cake sat untouched in the center, its candles still slightly bent from the heat. 7 and 4, a quiet 74th. She'd lit the candles herself, poured the wine herself, set the table for 5, though she briefly considered setting it for 3 just in case. But hope was a habit she hadn't quite outgrown. Todd arrived first, nearly 40 minutes late, his jacket flung over one arm, a Bluetooth earpiece still clinging to his right ear. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek without really looking at her, already texting someone back. "Sorry, Mom. Traffic," he muttered. Pam smiled and told him it was fine, even though it had been quiet on the roads all day. Jessica, his wife, arrived shortly after with an overdone apology and an expensive-looking gift bag that Pam suspected was picked up last minute. The tissue paper was still crinkled from the store's fold. Melissa, her daughter, came last, barely making it through the door before the food had cooled. Her twins were with their father this weekend, she explained, like an excuse that was supposed to cover more than just her tardiness. They sat, finally, around the table Pam had spent the day preparing. The roast was slightly overcooked, but she doubted anyone noticed. Most of the meal passed in shallow conversation work updates, minor complaints about taxes and mortgages, stories Pam wasn't part of. Every few minutes, one of them would glance down to check a phone. Notifications lit up their faces in ghostly blue flashes, carving their attention away from the room. Pam made a few attempts to engage them. "Did you hear from Aunt Lena?" Or, "The garden's already started blooming," but the responses came short, disinterested. And then Todd, halfway through a glass of wine, chuckled as he glanced at an old photograph hanging on the wallone from a trip Pam and her late husband had taken to Morocco decades ago. He raised his voice, smiling. "You're not thinking of traveling again, are you? You're too old for that now." The others laughed. Not cruelly, just lightly, casually, as though it was an obvious fact. Pam blinked. For a moment, it was as if the entire room had paused. The laughter echoed in her chest in an unfamiliar, hollow way. She smiled reflexively, politely, but something inside her shifted. Broke, maybe. Not loudly. Not in a way anyone else would notice. But something changed. She looked at her children, still caught in their jokes and phones and wine. The table she'd set with such care. The meal she'd prepared with quiet excitement. She had spent the entire week baking the lemon cake from scratch, the one John used to love. But they hadn't asked. Not about the cake, not about her. She watched them, each absorbed in their own world, and realized they had long stopped seeing her as someone with her own story to write. To them, she was a character in the background of their lives, reliable, stationary, safe. Pam didn't speak the rest of the evening unless spoken to. She laughed when prompted, nodded when appropriate, and smiled in all the right moments. But her mind was elsewhere. Not on her age. Not on the ache in her knees, but on the suitcase in the attic, and the way the sun once felt on her skin, far from home. The house was still. A hush had settled over everything, the kind of silence that comes only in the deepest hours of the night when the rest of the world has finally gone to sleep. The dishwasher had long stopped humming, the leftover dishes sat untouched in the sink, and the soft flicker of the living room lamp cast long, sleepy shadows on the walls. But Pam was wide awake. She stood at the foot of the attic stairs for a long moment, the pull-string light above her swinging faintly in the draft. The wooden steps groaned under her feet as she climbed slowly, carefully, like someone approaching an old memory with reverence and just a touch of fear. The attic smelled of cedar and dust, forgotten summers, packed away winters. She stepped carefully between the boxes and bins labeled with faded marker, Xmas 9, Todd High School, John's books. And then, in the far corner, beneath a yellowing tarp and tucked beside an old coat rack, she saw it. The suitcase. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled the tarp away. A layer of dust puffed into the air, catching in the shaft of moonlight slipping through the tiny attic window. She knelt slowly, the wood floor cool beneath her knees, and reached out. It was a navy blue hard-shell Samsonite with a slight scuff on the side from when a cab driver in Athens had dropped it against the curb. That memory came back instantly. So did others. The tag was still attached, dangling from the handle, the words Florence, Italy in faded print, along with the flight barcode and the initials J, P, Wembley, John, and Pam. Her throat tightened. She dragged it toward her, sitting down on the floor as if it had summoned her to confession. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she just stared at either past, her joy, her freedom captured in this one object that had sat untouched for nearly a decade. Traveling with John had been the only time she felt like the world truly belonged to her. No schedules dictated by others, no errands to run for grown children, no dinners where she smiled through the sting of invisibility. Just the two of them, walking down cobbled streets in places where no one knew their names. They had danced in an empty square in Lisbon to the sound of a nearby violin, laughed over spilled espresso in a Parisian café, gotten hopelessly lost in the back alleys of Kyoto, and never once felt afraid. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her not just the memories, but the feeling of being alive, of being seen, of being wanted, not for what she could give, but for who she was. Pam leaned back against the attic wall, her fingers still resting on the suitcase handle. The wood was cool, the air thin, but her chest was warm with something she hadn't felt in years. Longing, yes. But something else too. Resolve. For so long, she had told herself that part of her life was over. That it belonged in boxes, in old photographs, in carefully packed away keepsakes. But tonight, something had shifted. Maybe it was the silence at her birthday table, or the way her children had laughed without thinking. Or maybe it was just time. She ran her hand over the suitcase again and whispered quietly, "Not yet." The words surprised her, spoken aloud. Real. She didn't know what came next, not exactly. But for the first time in years, she wanted to find out. The attic stayed dark, but inside Pam, a light had turned back on. Pam sat curled on the couch in her flannel robe, a cup of lukewarm tea resting on the side table, untouched. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the late hour with quiet insistence. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the windows, a rhythm that matched the heaviness in her chest. Her phone, dimly lit on the cushion beside her, buzzed once then again. She reached for it with a sigh, already knowing what she would see. It was the family group chat. The name at the top still made her smile faintly, the Wembley Bunch. A name Todd had chosen years ago during a rare moment of whimsy. The chat had been created after John passed, a way to keep everyone connected, as Melissa had put it. But over time, that purpose had quietly eroded, replaced by noise. She scrolled through the latest flurry of messages. Jessica had sent another meme, something about wine o'clock and surviving toddlers. Melissa followed with a photo of her twins smearing chocolate on the walls, captioned, "Guess who's painting again?" Laughter emojis flooded in from Todd and Jessica. Then came a forwarded screenshot from Todd, something about gas prices. "Unreal. Just filled up the tank and it cost $74. At this rate, we'll need a second mortgage." A few lines below that, Melissa chimed in again, this time with a photo of a cracked sink in her downstairs bathroom. "Plumber says it's going to cost $500 to replace. Anyone know a cheaper guy?" Jessica replied almost immediately, "Maybe your mom knows someone? She always had a guy for everything." Pam kept scrolling, past grocery lists, past complaints about traffic, past an offhanded message from Toby, "Yo, Grandma still paying for Netflix or should I resub?" To which nobody replied. She scrolled slowly, rereading them all with a quiet ache in her chest. Not once, not even in passing, not a single message asking how she was doing. Not a, "How was your day?" or "Do you need anything?" Not a word about her birthday the night before beyond a thumbs-up emoji reacting to a picture of the cake, and certainly no follow-up today. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering, then pulled up the keyboard. Her fingers moved quickly. You know, sometimes it would be nice if someone asked how I was doing, not just shared memes or sent bills. I'm still here, still breathing, still hoping I matter to someone. She paused, reading the words over. Her heart thudded in her chest, half dread, half release. It was true, all of it. She deserved to say it, to remind them that she existed beyond her usefulness. Her thumb hovered over the send button. One press. That's all it would take. But instead, she hit backspace. Slowly, word by word, line by line, erasing what had briefly felt like a voice, like a plea. By the time the message box was empty again, her eyes were stinging. She set the phone down beside her, screen dimming to black, taking the weight of unsaid truth with it. She sat in silence, the only sound the whisper of rain and the ticking of the clock. She folded her arms over her chest, pulled the blanket tighter, and closed her eyes, not because she was tired, but because there was nothing left to look at. The doorbell rang just after noon, sharp and insistent. Pam looked up from her knitting, the soft clack of needles pausing in midair. She hadn't been expecting anyone, but as she stood and peeked through the window, she wasn't surprised to see Todd and Jessica on her front step, both wearing carefully neutral expressions. She opened the door with a polite smile. "Well, this is a surprise." Todd gave her a quick hug, brief and one-armed. "Hey, Mom. Thought we'd drop by. You got a minute?" Jessica followed closely behind, her smile tight and her heels clacking against the hardwood as she stepped into the living room. "We were in the neighborhood," she added, as if rehearsed. Pam didn't argue. She simply nodded and motioned toward the couch. "Have a seat. I'll put on some tea." By the time she returned with the tray, Jessica had already perched herself on the edge of the sofa like a talk show guest prepared for confrontation. And Todd was thumbing through the stack of travel brochures Pam had left on the side table. Florence, Venice, the Amalfi Coast, all neatly organized. She saw his lips press into a line before he set them aside. "You're really serious about this?" he asked, not meeting her eyes. Pam sat down across from them and began pouring tea. "About what, dear?" Jessica sighed, leaning forward slightly. "Italy, Pam. We heard from Melissa that you've been talking about it again. Alone." Pam's hands didn't tremble, but she felt the shift in the room like a wind picking up. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "It's been a long time since I traveled." Jessica exchanged a glance with Todd, then turned back with the kind of patience one reserves for a confused child. "Mom," she said gently, "you need to accept you're not young anymore. Traveling alone? It's not the same as it used to be." Pam didn't respond. She stirred her tea slowly, the spoon clinking against porcelain. "What if something happens?" Jessica continued. "What if you get sick? Who will take care of you in a foreign country? You could get lost or—" She hesitated, as if searching for a softer word, overwhelmed. Pam watched her daughter-in-law carefully. Jessica's concern was real, but it was painted over with a thick layer of condescension. It wasn't about safety, it was about control. About preserving the version of Pam that was small and predictable, the one who stayed within the neat parameters of Sunday dinners and birthday cards. "I appreciate the worry," Pam finally said. Her voice was calm, measured. Todd jumped in, his tone slightly more urgent. "Mom, we just don't want you getting into something you can't handle. And frankly, at your age, spontaneous travel is, well, it's risky. And kind of unrealistic." Pam met his eyes for the first time since they sat down. She said nothing. She didn't ask why they hadn't offered to travel with her, or even to help her prepare. She didn't ask why the topic was only brought up now, a week after her birthday had passed with barely any conversation. She simply observed them, both her son, wringing his hands, his wife, sipping tea as if she were doing Pam a favor by drinking it. Inside, she felt the space between them widening. Not out of spite, not even anger, just clarity, a quiet understanding that they didn't see her as she was. They saw a fragile woman in decline, rather than someone still capable of wonder. She nodded politely, let them finish their tea, and walked them to the door with a smile. They left reassured, thinking they'd talked her out of it. Pam shut the door softly behind them and turned back toward the travel brochures waiting on the side table. She picked up the one with the photo of the rolling Tuscan hills, and this time, she didn't just read it, she imagined herself there. Alone, free, whole. The pawn shop was quiet when Pam stepped inside, the bell above the door giving a meek chime that barely broke the stillness. The place smelled faintly of dust and metal polish, and behind the glass counters, jewelry lay lined in soft velvet trays, glinting under tired fluorescent lights. An older man stood behind the counter reading a newspaper, his glasses sliding down his nose. He looked up when he saw her, offering a polite nod, not quite recognizing her, but not surprised either. Pam clutched a small cloth pouch in her gloved hand. It had taken her the better part of a morning to gather the contents items that had sat untouched for years in her dresser drawer. A sapphire pendant John had given her on their 25th anniversary, a ring she wore briefly before arthritis made it too tight, and a pair of diamond studs from a Christmas long ago. None of it held real use anymore. The memories lived inside her, not in the metal. She placed the pouch gently on the counter, unrolling it with care. The man adjusted his glasses and leaned in. "Looking to sell?" Pam nodded. "Yes. I'd like to know what you can offer." He examined each piece with a practiced hand, weighing them, holding them up to the light, muttering quiet assessments. The silence between them was steady, undisturbed by small talk. She was grateful for that. Finally, he named a price. It was fair, more than she'd hoped for, even. She accepted without haggling. He counted the cash out neatly, placing the bills into a white envelope. She took it with both hands, nodding her thanks, and left as quietly as she had come. The whole exchange took less than 15 minutes, but as she stepped back out into the cold air, her heart pounded in her chest, as if she'd done something wicked or brave. She wasn't sure which yet. That afternoon, with the envelope resting beside her, she turned on her computer. She hadn't booked a flight in years. The process had changed: fewer agents, more drop-down menus. But the rhythm of planning a trip came back to her like muscle memory. The excitement, the nerves, the gentle hum of possibility. She searched flights to Florence. There was one that left in 2 weeks, a single layover in Frankfurt. She chose an aisle seat easier on her knees. She entered her card information slowly, double-checking everything. When the confirmation screen loaded, Pam sat there staring at it for a full minute, as if afraid to blink in case it vanished. She clicked print. The itinerary slid out of her old printer with a soft whir. She held the paper in her hands and read it 3 times, committing every detail to memory. Flight number, terminal, arrival time. It was real now. She took her old travel journal from the bookshelf, a leather-bound one with creased pages and faint ink from her last trip with John. In the middle of the journal, beneath a faded entry about a sunrise in Cinque Terre, she slipped the itinerary between the pages and closed the cover. Then she placed the journal back on the shelf, its spine aligned with the others like nothing had changed. But something had, something important. For the first time in years, Pam had made a decision for hers quietly, deliberately, without permission. And this time, she wouldn't tell a soul. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock above the stove. 11:47 p.m. The minute hand moved like it was carrying something heavy, dragging each second with a kind of reluctant ceremony. Pam sat at the kitchen table in her bathrobe, a single lamp glowing above her. Before her lay 3 blank envelopes and a stack of crisp stationery she'd kept in the drawer for years but rarely used, cream-colored with a faint blue border, slightly floral-scented. She'd been saving them for something important. Tonight felt like the right time. Her hands, though a bit stiff with age, moved with purpose. She began with Todd. She started simply, "Dear Todd," she wrote, then paused. For a moment, she didn't know how to continue. How could you possibly summarize a lifetime of disappointments and love in the same letter? But she wasn't here to scold. That wasn't the point of this. She told him that she loved him, truly, deeply, and always would. She told him she was proud of the man he had become, even if they hadn't always understood one another. She wrote about the day he was born, how his tiny hand had grasped her pinky finger in the hospital room and changed her life. Then, softly, she added that sometimes she missed the boy who used to ask her 100 questions about the world. She reminded him that she was still that woman who had answers if only he remembered to ask. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully, slid it into the envelope, and wrote his name across the front in slow, deliberate strokes. Next was Melissa. That letter came a little easier. Pam wrote about how strong her daughter had always been, how fiercely independent, how she admired her even if they clashed often. She reminded Melissa that strength doesn't always come from doing everything alone, and that asking how someone is, really asking, is a kind of strength too. She said she hoped that one day Melissa might find time for silence and softness, for something beyond managing and pushing and organizing. And then Jessica. This one was more difficult. There was less warmth to draw from. fewer memories that weren't tinted by tension. But still, Pam did not write with bitterness. She thanked Jessica for being Todd's partner, for raising their children well. She said she hoped that one day Jessica would understand that age is not a weakness, and that one day she too might feel overlooked and know how much small kindnesses matter. She ended the letter not with love, but with sincerity, and hoped that would be enough. Pam placed all 3 letters on the counter beside a yellow post-it note. Her handwriting was small and neat, almost playful. Gone for a while. Don't worry. Mom. She looked at the counter for a long moment before turning off the light. The morning came too quickly. At 4:30 a.m., Pam was already dressed in a comfortable navy blouse and soft black slacks. She'd laid the clothes out the night before, along with her passport and journal. The suitcase sat by the door, perfectly packed and zipped, a quiet promise of something new. At 5:00 on the dot, she locked the front door behind her. The sky was still dark, stars barely visible behind a veil of dawn. The cab waited at the curb, its engine idling softly, headlights casting long beams across the lawn. Pam didn't look back at the house. She climbed into the car, placed her hands gently on her lap, and took a slow, measured breath. She was going. No one had stopped her. No one even knew yet. And, for the first time in a long, long time, Pam felt completely free. Todd hadn't planned to stop by the house. He was only there to drop off Pam's mail. A few envelopes from the bank, 1 catalog, and a flyer for gutter cleaning. The kind of clutter she always asked him to toss. He let himself in with the spare key under the planter, still half convinced she'd be upstairs taking a nap or pruning the backyard roses. But the moment he stepped into the kitchen, something felt wrong. The air was too still. The house was spotless, unnervingly so. No teacup in the sink. No cardigan hanging from the back of the chair. Then he saw it. 3 envelopes neatly stacked on the kitchen counter. His name, Melissa's name, Jessica's. And beside them, a small yellow note. Gone for a while. Don't worry, Mom. His stomach dropped. He tore open the envelope addressed to him with shaking fingers. The letter was handwritten in Pam's careful script, measured and gentle. But it didn't read like a note from someone headed to the store. By the time he reached the end of it, his hands were clammy. Italy? He muttered. She actually went? He pulled out his phone and called her. Straight to voicemail. He called again. Nothing. Jessica picked up on the first ring. Hey, she said, clearly distracted. What's up? She's gone, Todd said, still staring at the empty kitchen. Mom. She's not here. What do you mean she's not there? Jessica asked. There's a note. She left letters for all of us. She flew to Italy. Alone. Silence. Then, you're kidding me. I'm standing in her kitchen right now, Jess. There's no suitcase. No sign of her. Her phone's off. That's insane. Jessica's voice rose. She's 74. She can't just run off across the world without telling anyone. That's reckless. Todd said nothing, jaw clenched. Jessica's voice was fast now, shrill with urgency. What if something happens to her over there? What if she falls, or forgets her meds? Does she even have travel insurance? I don't know. Call Melissa. Todd hung up and immediately called his sister. Melissa answered groggily. What's going on? Mom's gone. Gone where? To Italy. I'm at her house. There's a note. She left letters. Melissa was silent for a moment, then swore under her breath. She actually did it? Looks like it. I told you, she said. I told you when she brought up Florence last month that she wasn't kidding. I thought she was dreaming out loud. I didn't think she'd actually. Well, she did. Alone. The siblings fell into frantic conversation. Jessica was looped in via speakerphone. Ideas were thrown around embassy calls, checking with the airline, tracking her credit card. No one mentioned that none of them had noticed the signs. That no one had checked in enough to see it coming. She's going to get herself hurt, Jessica kept repeating. She's going to fall for some scam or get pickpocketed or… She's not stupid, Melissa said sharply. She's just tired of being invisible. That quieted everyone. And in Pam's now empty house, the note remained on the counter, fluttering slightly in the draft from the open door. her simple goodbye echoing louder than any of them could admit. The plane touched down just after noon. Pam sat by the window, her hands resting in her lap, fingers lightly brushing the soft fabric of her blouse. The landing gear shrieked as rubber met tarmac, and the plane shuddered with the weight of arrival. For a moment, she didn't move. She only stared out the tiny oval window at the blur of the Florence airport, sunlight glinting off metal, the far-off haze of green hills barely visible behind the terminal. She'd made it. The slow shuffle of passengers began. Overhead compartments creaked open. Bags were tugged down. Voices rose in different languages. And somewhere near the back, a child began to cry. Pam reached for her small carry-on and stood, steadying herself against the seat in front of her. Her knees protested, but she was used to that. She moved slowly through the aisle, heart pounding not from fear, but something else. Something giddy. Customs was easier than she expected. A young officer glanced at her passport, asked a few questions in a thick accent, then stamped the page with a dull thud. She walked through the sliding doors and was greeted by the smell of fuel, warm pavement, and a breeze that carried with it a whisper of cypress trees and espresso. It was all so familiar and yet new. Outside, a small placard with her name scribbled on it in blue marker waited near the arrivals curb. She smiled at the driver and nodded. He was young and polite, speaking English with enthusiasm, but limited vocabulary. The ride from the airport to the guest house took just under 30 minutes. Pam kept her eyes glued to the window the entire time, watching as the city unfolded like pages from an old bookstone churches, ivy-covered walls, motorbikes weaving through narrow lanes, flower boxes spilling over balconies, and laundry lines dancing in the wind. They stopped in front of a narrow yellow building with green shutters and a heavy wooden door. The sign above read Casa de Luz. The driver unloaded her suitcase and gave a polite bow before driving off, leaving her alone on the sun-warmed cobblestone. Pam rang the bell once. The door opened a moment later to reveal a small woman with short dark hair and a round, sun-worn face. "Buongiorno," she greeted warmly, her smile deepening the laugh lines around her mouth. Pam said, offering her hand. "Lucia," the woman replied, clasping both of Pam's hands between hers. "Welcome. You must be tired, no?" "A little," Pam admitted. Lucia led her up a narrow staircase, the walls lined with faded photographs and dried lavender bundles. Her room was cozy, with white lace curtains and a view of the city rooftops. Lucia set down Pam's suitcase and disappeared, returning moments later with 2 small cups of coffee on a silver tray. They sat by the window, sipping espresso. Pam's Italian was halting half-forgotten from old phrase books and John's enthusiastic tutoring. But Lucia was patient. They laughed at mispronunciations, pantomimed when words failed, and found common ground in smiles and warmth. Pam stared out over the terracotta rooftops, the distant dome of the Duomo rising above the city like a guardian. The air smelled of roasted beans and blooming jasmine. She inhaled deeply, as if the air itself could cleanse the decades from her chest. This wasn't just escape, it was arrival. She was here, not as a tourist, not as a mother or a grandmother or someone waiting on others. She was Pam, whole, alone, and glowing. The late afternoon sun spilled gold across the countryside as Pam sat on a bench nestled beneath a pair of olive trees just outside the guest house. Rolling hills stretched before her, dotted with cypress trees and rustic villas, their stone walls glowing in the warm light. In the distance, a farmer guided a mule down a sloping path. The air was thick with the scent of wild herbs and distant chimney smoke. Pam had brought her journal with her but hadn't yet opened it. She found herself too content, too full of the present moment to put pen to paper. The breeze brushed across her cheeks, lifting the edge of her scarf. She hadn't felt like this in years, unwatched, unscheduled, unneeded. Her phone buzzed in her lap. A single notification lit up the screen. A voice message from Rebecca. Pam hesitated for a moment before tapping play. "Hi, Grandma." Rebecca's voice came through, soft but worried. "Where are you? Are you okay?" "I saw Dad's texts. Everyone's panicking. But, I don't know. I hope you're doing what makes you happy. I mean that. I really do." The message was quiet for a second before Rebecca added, "I miss you." Pam listened to it twice. The tone in her granddaughter's voice wasn't frantic like the others. It wasn't demanding or blaming. It was curious, loving, like a hand gently placed on her shoulder in the dark. She smiled, a slow, private smile meant only for herself. It bloomed from a place in her chest that had long gone dormant. She looked out over the landscape again, the soft hum of the countryside filling her ears, the distant chirping of birds, the occasional whine of a motorbike somewhere far down the hill. Raising the phone, Pam opened the camera and turned slightly to capture the view before her. The photograph came out warm and crisp, the low horizon of dusty vineyards, an old villa tucked between sun-drenched trees, a hint of Florence's skyline in the distance. She added a short message. "I'm safe, sweetheart. And yes, I'm doing exactly what makes me happy." She pressed send. There was no explanation, no apology. Rebecca would understand. She always had. She was the one who sat quietly during dinners, who asked questions about Pam's youth, who listened when the others were busy talking over her. Pam remembered the time Rebecca came over with a bag of her own books, just so she and Grandma could swap titles. That wasn't so long ago, and yet it felt like another lifetime. The phone buzzed again, a heart reaction. Then another message. "It's beautiful. You look happy. I'm glad." Pam didn't respond immediately. She closed her eyes instead and let the sun rest on her face. It felt like permission, like confirmation that this wasn't selfish. It was necessary. For the first time in years, someone from her family wasn't trying to pull her back. Rebecca wasn't calling her home. She was letting her fly. The market square pulsed with life, the kind of vibrant energy Pam hadn't felt in years. Florence's Mercato di Sant'Ambrogio wasn't tourist-polished like the postcard versions of Italy. It was raw, and real voices shouting over crates of tomatoes, old women haggling with fishmongers, fresh herbs bundled in twine, and bread so fragrant it made her weak in the knees. She strolled slowly, weaving through the vendors and stalls, her canvas tote swinging at her side. People bustled past her with purpose, but she moved like someone in a dream. The sound of church bells echoed in the distance, mingling with the laughter of children and the murmur of Italian conversations. A man handed her a slice of pecorino to try. She smiled and accepted it, the taste sharp and earthy on her tongue. As she thanked him in broken Italian, she caught sight of a stall just ahead, its racks draped in scarves of every imaginable color. She walked toward it almost without meaning to. The scarves fluttered in the breeze like soft flags, beckoning her. A young woman behind the table greeted her cheerfully. Pam nodded, running her fingers along the fabric. Silk, cotton, linen. They were light and delicate and utterly impractical. And then her fingers stopped on one in particular, a deep wine red with embroidered gold stitching running along the edges. It wasn't a color she usually wore, too bold for her usual palette of pastels and neutrals. But it struck something inside her. She lifted it gently, holding it up to the light. Suddenly, she was young again, standing in a department store with John, not long after their engagement. She had picked up a hate-expensive, impractical, lovely. He had taken one look and said, "It's not really you, is it?" And just like that, she'd put it down. She didn't question it. She never had. Another image came next years later, trying on a fitted dress before a neighborhood party. Melissa had walked in and laughed. "Mom, you're not trying to compete with the younger wives, are you?" That dress stayed in the closet until it was out of style. Then Todd, asking her to cancel her book club meeting because he needed her to babysit. John had asked her to skip her photography class to host his boss's wife for tea. The twins wanted help with costumes. The yard needed mowing. Her mother had a doctor's appointment. She had always said yes. Pam stood in the middle of the scarf stall, holding the red and gold fabric, and felt the full weight of it, not the scar for life, the slow erosion of self. Piece by piece, season by season, she had tucked herself into the background of everyone else's needs. She draped the scarf around her neck and looked in a small mirror propped beside the table. The color lit her face. Her eyes looked brighter. Her hair, silver and wild from the wind, framed her like a halo. She didn't look silly. She didn't look like someone clinging to youth. She looked alive. "I'll take it," she said to the vendor, pulling out her euros. She walked away from the stall with the scarf still around her neck, not for warmth. Florence was warm today, but for something else entirely. Because it made her feel beautiful. And for once, that was reason enough. The house was unusually tense for a Saturday morning. Todd stood in the kitchen, pacing with his phone clenched in his hand, while Jessica sat at the island, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Melissa leaned against the counter, her lips pursed, eyes tired. The dining table still held the remains of a breakfast. No one had touched half-eaten toast, lukewarm coffee, and a smear of butter congealing on the edge of a plate. "Okay," Todd said sharply, breaking the silence. "Should we call the embassy? Report her missing?" Jessica rolled her eyes. "She's not missing, Todd. She left a note. She's just gone rogue." "Gone rogue? Are you hearing yourself?" Melissa said, pushing off the counter. "She's 74, alone, in a foreign country. No emergency contacts, no plan." "She does have a plan," Todd snapped. "The problem is, she didn't tell us about it." "Exactly," Jessica muttered. "Because it's not rational. I'm sorry, but is she even mentally fit to travel alone? Maybe this is some kind of breakdown." Melissa shook her head. "No, it's not a breakdown. It's a wake-up call. We've treated her like she's invisible for years. This is her finally doing something about it." Todd turned to her, his face flushed. "So what, we just sit here and let her wander around Italy like some stubborn teenager on a gap year?" "She's not wandering," Melissa said. "She's choosing." Jessica exhaled hard, tapping her nails against the marble countertop. "We should have seen this coming. I told you she seemed off at her birthday dinner. Remember how quiet she was?" "She was quiet because you were all staring at your phones," Melissa said, her voice rising. "You think I didn't notice? No one even asked how she was feeling. Not once." Todd's jaw tensed. "So now this is my fault?" "I'm saying maybe we've all been treating her more like a fixture than a person," Melissa shot back. "Something you assume will always be there until it isn't." Jessica stood, her face pale with frustration. "This isn't about feelings. This is about safety. What if something happens to her over there? She's not 25 anymore. What if she gets sick or mugged or, God forbid, just gets lost?" "She's not stupid," Melissa said. "She booked a trip, not a one-way ticket to oblivion." "Did she even tell Rebecca?" Todd asked suddenly. "She's the only one Mom still talks to regularly." Melissa shrugged. "If she did, Rebecca's not saying. She's probably the only one respecting her choice." A thick silence followed, one that made all of them feel a little too exposed. It was Jessica who spoke next, her voice lower, tinged with something that almost sounded like guilt. "I just don't get why she didn't trust us with this." Melissa looked at her. "Maybe it's not about trust. Maybe it's about freedom." Todd sank into a chair and stared at the cold coffee in front of him. None of them wanted to say it, but they all felt it. Pam's absence wasn't just a logistical problem to solve. It was a mirror. And what it reflected wasn't flattering. It was Melissa who insisted they sit down together to read the letters. They gathered in Todd and Jessica's living room, the curtains drawn halfway against the afternoon sun, the light filtering in soft and gold. The envelopes had sat unopened for days, first out of disbelief, then avoidance, and now a strange, uneasy reverence. Todd held them in his lap like they were made of something fragile, as if the paper might crumble under the weight of what it carried. "No more speculating," Melissa said. "We owe her that much." Todd handed out the envelopes. Each was labeled in Pam's careful handwriting, slanted just slightly to the right, as if leaning into each name. They opened them together. Melissa's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded hers. The letter began simply, without preamble. "Dear Melissa, you've always been the one who carried everything: responsibility, expectation, image. I saw it in you even as a little girl. You'd frown at your dolls if they weren't lined up just right. And maybe that's why I always stepped aside for you. You didn't want interference. You wanted space to do it your way. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as someone with thoughts of my own. You'd come over and rearrange the spices in my kitchen, tell me how to better organize my cupboards, ask why I still wore old shoes when I had nicer ones in the closet. I smiled every time, bit my tongue. But every small correction chipped away at me. I was no longer the mother you admired, but the woman you quietly pitied." Melissa blinked quickly, reading the next lines in silence, her mouth pressed into a flat, unreadable line. Todd's voice broke the quiet. He was halfway through his letter. "She remembers everything," he muttered, eyes scanning the page. The jokes I made. The way I ignored her when she tried to talk about travel last year. Jessica's letter had fewer pages, but her face turned slightly pale as she read. She didn't say anything, just sat back on the couch, the letter resting lightly in her hands as though it weighed more than she could hold. Todd cleared his throat and continued reading aloud, his voice low. You used to come to me for everything: advice, comfort, encouragement. I never once turned you away. And yet in the last 10 years, I've become something else. A calendar alert. A ride service. A wallet. You once said to me, Mom, you've got nothing but time. You didn't mean it cruelly, but it stung, because it meant you didn't see the way I still craved meaning, adventure, joy. He paused, blinking hard, and finished the last line. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten how to live. Melissa looked down at her own letter. Her mother had written the same thing. Jessica quietly folded hers and whispered, almost to herself, mine too. They sat in silence, the air heavy with something unspoken. Not guilt alone, not regret alone. It was deeper than Thetan awakening, maybe. A reckoning. Pam had left them something more than an explanation. She had given them a reflection of themselves, and a glimpse of the woman they had forgotten to see. The message came just as Pam was settling in for the evening, a bowl of minestrone in her lap and a soft breeze curling through the shutters. The sky beyond her window had turned that dusky lavender she'd come to associate with Florence, the color of quiet endings and soft beginnings. She set her spoon down and reached for her phone, half expecting another meaningless update from her travel app or a notification from the local weather. But it wasn't that. It was from Rebecca. Pam blinked and opened it slowly, her heartbeat quickening with something warm and nervous. Can I come visit you for a week? I want to see what made you brave. Pam stared at the screen, the words swimming slightly as emotion pressed behind her eyes. She read it again, slower this time. I want to see what made you brave. Not where are you? Not why did you leave us? But this curious, sincere, spoken without demand. The message settled into her like a seed. For a moment she hesitated. It wasn't because she didn't want to see Rebecca of all her family. Rebecca had always been the one who made space for her, who listened, who saw her. But Pam had only just begun to feel the edges of her own life again, the rhythms of solitude, the freedom of being unnamed by others. She had stepped out of the role of matriarch, of constant giver, and stepped into something that felt more like herself. She feared, a little, that letting someone from that old world in, even someone like Rebecca, might blur the lines she was only beginning to draw. But Rebecca had asked to see, not to fix, not to pull her back. And that made all the difference. Pam's fingers hovered over the screen for a long moment. Then, with a quiet breath, she typed her reply. Only if you promise not to bring anyone else. The message sent with a quiet ping, and Pam stared at the little bubbles as they pulsed with Rebecca's typing. I promise, just me. I want to understand, Grandma. I want to learn how you did it. Pam smiled and leaned back in her chair, the soup forgotten for now. The sky outside had turned darker, stars beginning to bloom one by one in the gaps between the clouds. She thought of the girl who used to sit at her kitchen table and ask about the places in her photo albums, wide-eyed and dreaming. She thought of Rebecca thumbing through her old travel books, asking what it smelled like in Morocco, or if the canals in Venice really looked like melted glass. There had always been a spark in that girl. Maybe now it was growing into a flame. Pam picked up her soup again and took a slow spoonful, savoring it. There would be time to tidy the extra room, time to plan which markets to show her, which hills to climb. But for tonight, it was enough to know that someone she loved saw her not as someone who disappeared but as someone who dared. And she would welcome that kind of visitor. Always. Rebecca stepped off the train just before noon, her bag slung over one shoulder and her eyes wide with the shimmer of a city that lived up to its postcards. Florence wrapped around her like a storybook, red-tiled roofs stretching toward the sky, the faint scent of espresso wafting from nearby cafes, and the sound of bells echoing from somewhere far off. She had traveled abroad once before in college, but this felt different, more personal. And then, standing near the edge of the platform, was her grandmother. Pam was wearing linen trousers and a soft blue blouse, a wide-brimmed straw hat, casting a delicate shadow over her face. She looked rested, glowing, even. Her eyes sparkled with something Rebecca couldn't quite name: joy, maybe, or freedom. Whatever it was, it stunned her. "Grandma," Rebecca said, approaching with a half-laugh of disbelief, "you look amazing." Pam chuckled and opened her arms. "Travel suits me." They hugged tightly, the kind of hug that says more than words ever could. As they pulled apart, Rebecca studied her grandmother again. She looked 10 years younger, her posture lighter, her presence fuller. "I feel amazing," Pam added, reading her granddaughter's thoughts. That afternoon, they wandered through the city with no particular destination. They stopped at a gelateria near the Arno River, choosing flavors with childlike delight: lemon basil for Pam, dark chocolate and raspberry for Rebecca. They sat by the stone wall overlooking the slow-moving water, the sun brushing their shoulders and the breeze lifting curls of hair from their faces. People passed by on bicycles, lovers walked hand in hand, and an old man played the accordion a few steps away. Rebecca licked her gelato and leaned back. "I think I get it now," she said. Pam tilted her head. "Get what, dear?" "This," Rebecca gestured to the city, to the moment, to her grandmother. "Why you left. Why you didn't tell anyone." Pam nodded slowly. She took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the water. "I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to explain something that should have been obvious. I've spent most of my life being convenient to others. Predictable, someone who would always say yes." Rebecca said nothing, giving her space. Pam's voice was soft but steady. "After your grandfather died, I tried to hold everything together. The family, the traditions, the little things. But no one noticed how tired I was. How invisible I felt. They remembered me when they needed something: money, help, a babysitter, but rarely as a person who still wanted things, who still dreamed." Rebecca's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She just reached for Pam's hand and held it tightly. "I didn't leave out of anger," Pam said, voice quiet. "I left because I finally remembered I had a life, one that belonged to me." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that heals instead of hurts. When they rose to walk again, the cobbled streets felt like a path through time, through pain, through rediscovery, through love rediscovered. Pam told stories she hadn't told in years, stories of her youth, her travels with John, the things she'd wanted to do but postponed. And Rebecca, walking beside her, saw her not as someone escaping old age, but as someone who had finally embraced life. Pam was sitting on the small balcony of her guest house, a book open on her lap, but untouched for the past half hour. The sun was beginning to set, casting warm streaks of amber over the terracotta rooftops. From her seat, she could just hear the faint murmur of voices from the street below, locals talking over wine, the distant hum of a Vespa cutting through the calm. She sipped from a glass of chilled white wine, savoring the quiet. For the first time in years, peace wasn't a luxury she had to chase. It simply existed around her, in her, like it belonged. The phone buzzed on the table beside her, its screen lighting up with a name she hadn't seen since she boarded the plane. "Todd?" She stared at it, her thumb hovering for a second longer than necessary before answering. "Hello?" There was a pause, and then his voice is softer than usual, low and unsteady. "Mom." Pam said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch just a little longer. Not out of cruelty, but out of caution. "I didn't think you'd pick up," he said. "I almost didn't," she replied honestly. "I get it." Another pause. Pam could hear him breathing on the other end, like he was pacing, collecting his thoughts. Then, "I wanted to say I'm sorry. I mean it. I've been thinking about what you said, about the letters, about everything, really." She said nothing. She'd waited years for him to speak to her like this, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure if it was too late. "I didn't realize what we were doing," Todd continued, his words slow, deliberate. "How small we made your world. How we just expected you to always be there. Available, quiet, helpful." Pam closed her book, resting it on the table. The sun was dipping lower now, turning the sky a gentle coral. "I still don't totally understand all of it," Todd said, and she could hear the strain in his voice note from defensiveness, but vulnerability. "I don't know what it's like to feel invisible, to be taken for granted. But I think you're right. We stopped seeing you. Somewhere along the way, we stopped looking. Pam felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition, acknowledgement. I'm trying, Mom, he said. I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know if I can. But I wanted you to know that I hear you now, and I'm trying. Pam let the silence linger for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice even. I'm glad you're thinking about it, she said. That's more than I ever expected. Todd let out a breath. Does that mean we can talk more? When you're ready? Maybe, she said softly. One day. But I'm still figuring out what I need, and right now, I need space. Okay, he said. I understand. For the first time in a long time, Pam believed he meant it. They said goodbye without ceremony. No promises, no expectations. Just the soft click of understanding beginning to take shape. Pam turned her face back toward the fading light. The world was still hers, and she wasn't ready to give it back, not yet. The call came in the early evening, just as the sky over Florence began to blush with its familiar lavender-pink hue. Pam was in the kitchen of the guest house, slicing ripe tomatoes and basil for a simple caprese salad. She hummed to herself as the breeze from the open window stirred the linen curtains, carrying in the scent of blooming jasmine. Her phone buzzed against the countertop. She dried her hands on a towel and glanced down at the screen. Jessica. Pam's thumb hovered over the green button. A week ago, she might have let it ring out. A week ago, the idea of hearing Jessica's clipped voice, always composed, always a little too precise, would have sent her into retreat. But something about the message from Todd earlier, the look in Rebecca's eyes as they walked the streets of Florence, and the quiet she had finally begun to feel inside made her pause. She answered, "Hello?" There was a beat of silence, and then Jessica's voice inaudibly different. Not firm, not condescending, but tentative. "Hi, Pam," she said, and then added, "I hope it's okay that I'm calling." Pam wiped her fingers again, even though they were already dry. "I'm listening." Jessica took a breath. "I've been thinking. A lot, actually. Since you left. Since we got your letter." Pam remained quiet, not offering any lifeline, not rushing in to soothe. Jessica continued, the words more raw than Pam had ever heard from her. "I think I treated you like furniture. That's the word that keeps coming to me. Like you were just there. Expected, taken for granted, something permanent and silent in the background of our lives." Pam inhaled slowly. "I'm not proud of it," Jessica added, her voice cracking. "I don't think I've ever really seen you for who you are, not as a person who had dreams or limits, just someone to help when it was convenient, someone to keep the machine running." Pam felt the prick of tears behind her eyes. It wasn't the confession itself, it was the rare vulnerability in it. Jessica, who always had an answer. Jessica, who rarely admitted fault. "I didn't mean to become that person," Jessica went on, "but I did, and I'm sorry." Pam leaned against the counter and stared out the window. The sunset was deepening, casting long orange shadows across the neighboring rooftops. Her throat tightened. "Thank you for saying that," she said, her voice soft but clear. "That couldn't have been easy." "No," Jessica admitted, "but it was necessary." Pam closed her eyes for a moment, letting the emotion pass through her like a tide. "I'm still thinking," she said finally. "Still figuring out what this all means for me. For all of us." "I understand," Jessica said. "Take all the time you need." They didn't say goodbye with grand declarations. Just a quiet, mutual silence that felt like the softest beginning of something not yet named. After Pam hung up, she stood there for a long while, her hand still resting on the counter, the knife beside the tomatoes untouched. She wasn't sure if things could ever be what they once were. But maybe, just maybe, they could become something better. The plane touched down on a gray skied afternoon. Chicago's skyline loomed in the distance as Pam looked out the small oval window, watching as the clouds thinned and the world she had once known came back into view. It had been nearly a month since she left, but everything in her felt rearranged. Not in a loud, dramatic way, more like furniture quietly shifted in a house after years of gathering dust. This return wasn't an act of surrender. It wasn't because of Todd's softened voice, or Jessica's apology, or Melissa's silence. It wasn't even for Rebecca, though her presence in Pam's life had become a steady warmth, a soft hum of shared understanding. No, Pam came back because she wanted to, because she had reclaimed the right to choose, and for the first time in years, the choice was truly hers. The cab ride from the airport passed in a blur. The familiar streets rolled by, but they didn't seem to hold the same grip over her anymore. She wasn't going back to the house she had lived in for decades. That place, though filled with memories, also carried the weight of obligation, the echo of roles she no longer wanted to play. Instead, she directed the driver to a quiet brick building in the heart of downtown, an old converted walk-up with ivy on the side and a corner view of a small city park. The apartment was modest, one bedroom, just enough space for her books, her paints, and her silence. She had signed the lease from Florence, scanning and emailing documents while sipping espresso on a cobbled street corner. The key clicked in the lock with a satisfying finality. Her new apartment smelled of fresh paint and lemon oil. No one had ever lived in it before her. She placed her suitcase by the door and walked through the space slowly. The hardwood floors creaked under her feet in a friendly, lived-in way. The windows let in pale winter light. She ran her hand along the windowsill and smiled. It didn't feel like downsizing, it felt like liberation. Over the next few weeks, Pam filled her days deliberately, choosing only what gave her joy. She signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, a quiet group of older women, and two chatty retirees named Harold and Louise. She hadn't painted since college, but the feel of a brush between her fingers, the mess of color, the imperfection of it thrilled her. She also joined a local travel group for seniors, not because she needed companionship, but because she was curious. Their first meeting was held in a library conference room, and the itinerary for the coming year included Maine, Iceland, and a rail tour through the Canadian Rockies. Pam circled 2 trips without hesitation. She walked to the farmer's market every Saturday and bought herself fresh flowers. She sat in cafes and read poetry. She called Rebecca once a week, but never out of loneliness, only love. Everything was different now. Not because the world had changed, but because she had. And that was enough. The scent of roasted rosemary chicken filled the apartment, mixing with the warm aroma of garlic and fresh bread. Pam moved through her small kitchen with calm confidence, arranging plates and pouring wine, her cheeks flushed not with effort but with joy. The table was modest, just 6 seats, but every setting was intentional. Every dish was chosen with care. This wasn't the kind of dinner she used to host out of obligation or routine. This was something else entirely. It had been months since she returned, but the transformation in her life was as visible now as the framed watercolors that lined the wall. Her own work, painted with a kind of freedom that couldn't be faked. Her hair was longer than usual, streaked proudly with silver, and she wore a flowing indigo blouse she'd bought in Florence from a street vendor who insisted it brought out her eyes. It did. She looked like herself, or perhaps more truthfully, like the version of herself she had always kept tucked away for later. The doorbell rang. Pam smiled and moved to answer it. "Hey, Grandma." Rebecca stood there with a bouquet of sunflowers and a bottle of wine. She leaned in for a hug, warm and tight, and whispered, "You smell like Italy." Pam laughed and pulled her inside. "And you smell like college debt?" They were still laughing when Todd arrived. He came alone, his expression cautious but hopeful. He held a dessert box in one hand and a bottle of her favorite mineral water in the other, a small gesture, but one that meant more than he realized. He glanced around the apartment as he stepped in, taking in the art, the plants by the windowsill, the half-finished puzzle on the side table. "This is really nice, Mom," he said, his voice lower than usual. Pam nodded. "It is. Thank you." As everyone gathered around the table, the space filled with quiet conversation and the occasional burst of laughter, Jessica hadn't been invited. Not because Pam was punishing her, she had accepted the apology, but because she was still learning how to let boundaries breathe. And Melissa had declined politely, citing a scheduling conflict. Pam didn't press. Tonight wasn't about completing some familial picture. It was about honoring the new frame she'd built. The plates were filled, glasses poured, and the room hummed with something warm and real. Partway through the meal, Rebecca clinked her fork lightly against her glass. "Grandma, would you make a toast?" Pam looked up, surprised but not unready. She stood slowly, her hand steady as she lifted her wine. Her eyes moved across the table, resting for a moment on each person. To never being too old, she said, her voice clear and bright, for anything, especially to be free. There was a quiet hush, the kind that means people are actually listening. To being seen, she added after a moment, her eyes locking gently with Todd's. And to seeing ourselves before it's too late. Rebecca raised her glass first. To freedom, she said. The others followed. And as they drank, Pam sat back in her chair, the candlelight soft against her skin, and smiled. Not the forced kind she used to offer, but one that came from deep within. She was not a fixture anymore. She was not a footnote. She was the author now.